bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. So bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. You're rich in love and you're slow to anger. Your name is great and your heart is kind. For all your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. So bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. And on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come, still my soul will sing your praise unending. 10,000 years and then forevermore. So bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. Bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. Worship your holy name. Lord, I worship your holy name. So bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. I'll worship your holy name. Lord, I'll worship your holy name.
As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night. While they say to me all the day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul. How I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have gone over me. By day the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy, as with a deadly wound in my bones? My adversaries taunt me, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. Amen. So we're looking at, again, how to form and identify ourselves as what I'm calling a gospel culture. We looked at a couple of examples of what we aspire to look like as a wisdom culture, a culture of wisdom that represents the gospel wisely in the broader culture of the unbelieving world, particularly in times like we're in right now. So much confusion, so much anxiety, so much distress. And it strikes me that a lot of the Christian response in and to the broader culture tends to latch on to certain aspects of what are a part of our culture, what should be a part of a biblical culture, but then they take those to such an extent, or they apply them in such a way that it turns out not to actually be of much use. So we looked at that a bit last week. I want to build on that, but look at it from a couple different angles. Where last week we talked about the priorities of the church in terms of teaching. We mainly looked at teaching by way of encouragement and also by way of admonition or warning. And then how those two impulses, which are good impulses to teach and admonish, how they turn into misplaced priorities, or how those priorities become carried out, but in an unwise manner. This week, we're going to, it's the same basic conversation, but I want to look a little bit more at what we might just focus in on as discipleship in a church's life, in the life of each believer, and how as any disciple has to reckon with a couple of impulses that could seem to be competing at points, maybe pull against each other. How do we navigate that? And then I'm going to give you some examples of how I think that gets played out in the culture, in the evangelical culture most specifically, but in the broader culture also, how that gets played out in ways that also can be unhelpful or turn out to be actually work against the goal they're trying to serve. So I'm going to do this by branching off in a couple different directions, similar to what we did last week with the sort of flow chart. Every disciple is brought into a walk with Jesus and then begins to have to reckon with a couple of different necessary components of discipleship. One is the need to order their lives, to order their walk with God according to biblical standards. Just think of Jesus in the Great Commission. Go into all the world, proclaim the gospel, but also baptizing them and teaching them to obey all things that I've commanded you. That's a call, not just to follow Jesus, but to conform to a set of standards that's going to require, for someone joining that call, for someone joining themselves to the Lord, that's going to require that they maintain and start to cultivate a sense of order in how their Christian life gets walked out. That's an important priority in the life of a believer. It's an important priority that every church should be seeking to implement an order that keeps us grounded and conformed to a set of biblical standards. It's really hard to overstate. Turns out not to be so easy to do, however. So I want to look at tracing this out a little bit. So let's just focus for a minute on the corporate life of the church. When we assemble together, when we meet for worship, how the church is governed, how it's structured, how the leadership particularly sets up this pattern for us to conform to these standards. That will usually bring in a conversation about administration. It's true, you hear this said a lot in Christian circles, and it's basically true, that Jesus did not come simply to establish a new religious institution, right? I've heard that for years. I don't know how many times I've said it, but I say it because it's true. It's certainly true that he came to sort of upend a corrupt religious institution, the religious establishment of the temple state, the Sadducees and the priesthood, the corrupt high priesthood of his day. All this is a sort of religious establishment, an administrative state, an institution, if you will, that he really subverts and basically upends in his teaching. So that's all true. Jesus didn't come merely to set up a new religious institution to take the place of the old one. There's a sense, however, in which when he builds his church, and what you see developing throughout the book of Acts, that assembly of people, right, what we would call the church of the New Testament, they do function with an institutional authority that Jesus gave them. That's why, again, in the Great Commission, he says, before he sends them, go and preach the gospel and baptize and make disciples. That's why he says before that, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. There's a sense in which the church that follows Jesus is functioning like a new institution that's meant to supplant the authority of the existing one in Jerusalem of his day. So we have to think about that in terms of functional authority and in terms of there's a sense in which the church is administering truth in a way that has them acting something like an institution. So we have to be careful not to discard the idea that since Jesus didn't come to establish an institutional religion, that therefore institutions have no bearing on what the church does. This is a tricky line to walk. We're going to unpack this a little bit, but I just lay it out for us here. When you see the apostles throughout the book of Acts directly challenging the temple authorities, being confronted by the temple leadership, they are challenging and subverting that religious institution. But as they're doing that, they sort of by default, and I would argue more intentionally than that Jesus sends them out with the explicit purpose that they would become a new sort of institutional leadership. That's important to qualify. They're not going to be just another religious institution, but they do serve that function in important ways. And institutions generally do serve an important function in society that sometimes as evangelicals we get a little sort of snarky about, and just we think we can dismiss all institutional authority. And I think that may be a mistake that goes too far, but just to sympathize for a minute, you kind of understand where that comes from, right? What's tricky is that there is no real tightly there is no carefully laid out definitive guide to how the church should be governed and how it should be structured formally or liturgically in the New Testament. It just doesn't come across with any clear, definitive, here's the handbook for how you build this institutional form. The apostles just don't do that. Like in the book of Acts, they just take off doing stuff and teaching things, and what develops. They don't have a business plan. They don't write it out and say, here's exactly how everything should go. There is no specific formal structure put in place as to how the church is supposed to be administered. So this just, in some sense, develops organically. But that is not to say that there is no appointed structure. There is. Paul says, I sent you to appoint elders in every city. There is leadership that is appointed. It's given an official role, function for sure. And then the pattern for how that gets worked out happens individually in different churches and different communities somewhat differently. And we're not sure exactly how this should look. But it's not the case that they just run around doing whatever they want and the apostles sign off and rubber stamp it. They don't. They want some sort of order to uphold the standards, but they don't give you a handbook for how it's supposed to exactly look. Some of their forms and some of their practices they would have borrowed or essentially just adopted from the synagogue structure. These guys were all practicing Jews. They grew up in synagogue. They knew sort of by memory, they knew by experience that there are certain ways that we come together and worship, and they kept a lot of those. The public reading of Scripture, the teaching and exhortation that you read about in Paul's epistle to Timothy. When he says those things that we talked about last week, until I come, give attention to reading and exhortation and teaching, he's drawing on the actual process of a synagogue liturgy. That's what they did in the synagogue. So they just borrowed that form and adopted it, basically. But they don't adopt it full scale. They don't take everything the synagogue had to offer and do it exactly the way that they did it. For one thing, they're meeting in homes most of the time, so that doesn't exactly translate. So it's a loose interpretation of synagogue forms and patterns and habits and structures, but it is relying on some of those nevertheless. So there is a basic principle, there are basic principles at play. Some of it actually is borrowed from the temple, the structure and liturgy of the temple in the Old Testament. David sets up. Before that, the tabernacle. Some of that the church brings in to help inform how they structure their meetings and what they're supposed to be prioritizing. And those become useful as sort of helping to set priorities and standards. So we have to talk about things like administration, formal structures, and how to uphold standards in the church with the flexibility that the apostles leave open for us, but with respect to the fact that we're meant to function like an institution in some way, where we can't just have it willy-nilly, anybody does what they want. So I want to work through that a little bit. First, just look at a couple verses with me. Romans 12:8. It's actually listed among these spiritual gifts that are given, what you might call a gift of administration. He who exhorts in his exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence. That there is the word we would talk about we might say, he who governs. It's a word involving authority, involving how leadership helps administer things in the church and maintain order and structure. But it's paramount here, and we'll talk about this some more, to emphasize that, as Paul lays it out here even, that this type of leadership, this gift that God gives to administer things in the church, is given for the sake of taking care of others. We'll build on this in a moment, but when you see things like this, pointing out functions of leadership, positions of leadership in the church, and how to administer things in the body, it's important that every time you read about something like this, it's meant to be, as Paul lays it out here, God's grace it gives us differing gifts, and these gifts are given so that each person who, it's wrong to say possesses the gift, but practices the gift, would work it out for the sake of other people in the church and for the sake of the church being built up as a body. This is the first trap of thinking about administration and, well, how are we going to order things in the church, is that we tend to describe it in language that's hierarchical. You're in a position of leadership, so your job is to tend to administration, and therefore you need the authority to do that. So the way we tend to think about that, especially people in these positions and with these gifts, we tend to think about it in terms of just, since I'm in this position, these people should do what I say, because that will go better for everyone. And the Bible doesn't lay it out that way. It is very much meant to be a gift from God that he simply works through you if you practice the gift, but for the sake of someone else. And it's such a trap for leadership and people in authority to take that grace that God's given them and think then that their job is to control other people or make them do the right things because God's put them in the position where I'm supposed to get people to do the right thing. And it's a terrible trap, but it's really easy to fall into. Look at 1 Thessalonians 5 in verse 12. We request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. So there is here, this is the same word here, Paul uses in Romans 12. Here it's interpreted as have charge over you. It's a little stronger, picks up that note of authority a little bit more. And I think that's appropriate here. That's essentially what he means, that there is some sense where leadership who has to govern the affairs of the church, who have administrative roles in the church, they have to have some sense where the position of authority that they have has to distinguish them in some way. That's appropriate if I read Paul correctly here. But equally appropriate, and actually very important, is that we recognize they are honored, they are granted the honor of holding that position of authority because they've earned it, right? Because people who put themselves under their authority look at their character, look at their behavior, look at their leadership, look at the work that they do, the labor that they put in, and they put themselves under their leadership willingly, approvingly. They respect them enough that they are willing to submit to their leadership. And in those cases, Paul says that appreciation for those who labor in this way and have charge over you, it puts them in the position because they've earned that, right? I know a lot of times evangelicals have a tough time talking about language of merit, right? Because we know that salvation is not earned by behavior and by good deeds, but respect from peers and positions of authority. I think it's a high time we allow the language of merit to sort of take over, to permeate. People who are in these positions and who the Bible tells us we should esteem them in those positions should be esteemed not because they're in those positions, but because they have merited that respect. And so it's weird because in a way we tend to avoid so much merit theology when it comes to salvation. We don't want to give the sense that, well, you earn anything from God in terms of your salvation, that we shy away from merit language altogether. And I think that's a mistake. Leaders should have to merit the respect that congregations give them. And we just maybe don't read these things carefully enough. And I'm going to push back on that a little bit. That is to say, there is a position of honor, or at least authority, that we do have to give leadership in the church to be able to function properly and administer things appropriately. But that respect, that honor should be earned. It should be deserved because of their work and because of their character. 1 Timothy 3, verse 4 and 5. It's the same word going to pop up here, but again, you'll see some of the nuance in the way that it's used. He must be one, this is talking about the qualifications for eldership, pastoral leadership in the church. An elder must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? So church government here is in mind, but to use an example of why an elder who's going to administer affairs of church government has to be appropriately qualified, he's going to talk about how he orders his family, how he keeps his children in submission is the way it's worded here, or translated some places, under control in the ESV. He manages his household, and his children are then submissive or under control. And Paul says that's appropriate. In the ancient world, this is the way the father was responsible for not just his children, but his entire household. It could have included servants, it would be his wife, certainly. But mainly here we'd address this to children. If children were rebellious or if children were unruly, that reflected very poorly on the head of a household in the ancient world. It would have been a shame, it would have been a disgrace, it would have been a dishonor that would be taken really seriously in the Greco-Roman world and context of Paul's writing. The same principle then has application for the church when pastoral leadership should also be able to manage the church well. And that's the parallel he makes here. And notice he did a subtle little shift, though, on this. When he talks about the children, they should be under submission. They should be under control. When he makes the application over to the household of God, he says he should manage the household of God by taking care of it. It's a subtle little shift if you're paying attention. It's not a matter, again, of pastors simply keeping the people in their congregation under control in exactly the same way that they're supposed to keep their children under control, right? Paul has a little more respect for the people in the congregation than to directly analogize them to children. So he says, you should care for them. You keep your kids under control. Care for your congregation. Just a subtle distinction there, but I think that's interesting, and probably we should take note of that. But the general point remains that part of the pastor's job, part of the administrative leadership's job, is to maintain order in the church. It's just hard to overstate how important that is. The upshot of all this, basically, is that when you have this commitment to order and administration being properly done, when you properly live that out, what it will lead to is a church and a church culture that doesn't set out to be an administrative culture necessarily, but that in being a culture of order, a culture of standards, will administer things in such a way that the administrative gifts working in the church will help form people. They'll help form the spiritual development and the ethics of the church and how it thinks and lives. And it will be a protective structure that guards against false teaching, that guards against impurity. And so all these things have tremendous value. It starts with a commitment to being a church that cultivates a culture of order. That is to say, a culture opposed to chaos, a culture opposed to libertinism. That's a tight line to walk. Again, since we're not given, it's not laid out like a business manual or a government legal code. We have to navigate how to do this. And it takes, as Paul writes in Romans 12, it takes gifts operating, it takes God's grace operating through the gifts of the Spirit, lived out with real people in real life together. And then it comes out looking something like an ordered system, right? It's interesting that the apostles don't lay out a system that we can then fit into. They lay out the grace and the gifts and the love for one another. And then what comes out is something that resembles or functions like a system. I'm not sure it's fair to call it a system. I don't think that's actually accurate. But it is supposed to function something like an institution or a system. It just isn't supposed to start there. And this is where I think a lot of churches have gotten this sort of backwards, boots on the wrong feet kind of thing. That is to say, to maintain things in a structured manner, to maintain order, to keep things from spinning out of control, a lot of churches have built an institutional culture. They have prioritized administration to such an extent that you could fairly call them or describe them as an administrative culture. That gets us dangerously close to being overly corporatized in our model, right? You start to look like a business more than a church. You start to look like a government bureaucracy more than a family. And that trend's dangerous. It's not all bad. But you do see churches sort of succumbing to this. An institutional culture can turn into an institutionalist culture, right? Where the priority becomes maintaining the institution. This is dangerous. It's already hinted at, said before, institutions actually, I think, are important. I think we're actually realizing now in our broader cultural milieu, in the situation we find ourselves in, how institutions matter. It's an interesting thing to ponder. There have been really interesting and incisive books written about this, not from a necessarily Christian perspective, but sociologically. I could recommend some of those later, but that's not our conversation for today. But you see generally in a time where we have a high degree of turmoil, a genuine crisis on our hands, where does everyone look to for answers? We tend to look to institutions that do this thing for a living, right? Expert opinion. We need institutions in some sense, or at least we all have a sort of impulse to gravitate toward them, mostly when things are breaking apart. When chaos is ensuing around us, that's when we realize, man, it'd be great if we had responsible people in positions of authority who can give us some guidance or distribute funds or make things happen or fix problems. And without institutions, trustworthy, reliable, responsible institutions in place, it's actually difficult to know, well, what do we do? And I think you see this right now. A lot of people are sort of feeling this. There's a sort of panic that has set in because a lot of people just don't feel like the institutions either care or are competent. But that's partly our fault because a lot of us had cast off any trust in institutions a long time ago. Not without good reason, but you see the need for some institutional structure. You see that most acutely when things start to fragment, when things start to go haywire. And I think we're living through a lot of that right now. So the benefit of institutions is they're stable in times of crisis. In times of turmoil, they provide stability, which at their best is what institutions are supposed to do. That's the sense in which the church is supposed to function like an institution. Why? Not because God simply wants another institution where the structures are there just so people follow the rules. The structural aspect of this is important because to meet people's needs and to properly witness to the gospel, it's helpful to be relied upon and stable when everyone around you is looking for answers. That is precisely why the church should function like and think of themselves in institutional terms, even though we don't really consider ourselves an institution. But we do want to have the stability that when people are looking for answers and need help, we can jump in and give it. We can marshal resources. We can muster the manpower. We can give answers that come from a place of coherence and then they're cogent and they make sense, right? We're not just scrambling to think about these things. We've already thought them through. That's all important, and it's an institutional function that the church ought to be doing. However, if a church decides, well, what we'll do is we'll become an administrative culture, and we'll focus so much on building this institution as an institution. What tends to happen in those cases is that there is an inflexibility, right? What you're signing up for is stability. Sometimes what you get is an overly rigid, inflexible commitment to the institutional forms that you've built, especially when you spend a lot of time building them and a lot of work goes into it and a lot of money. And you're mortgaged out. We've got this structure in place. We don't want to really, we don't want to really move it. We don't want to change it. But then that leads to a problem where when massive upheaval comes and it requires change, it requires flexibility, the institution is set. It can't move, right? This is a tough trick as well. You might think, just to get to a biblical example here, you might think of the situation in Acts chapter 6. The early church in Acts 6, when a challenge of numerical growth and like a demographic change leads to a pretty significant social disruption among the apostles, among the disciples at that time. You have mainly Hebrew-speaking Jewish believers in the Jerusalem church, and there's been this influx of Hellenistic Jews who've joined the faith, and they would largely be Greek-speaking and have adopted a lot more Greek culture than the Jewish believers would have let in. When this sort of creates a social disruption and some cultural challenges, they really start to cause the things to fray and to get like the seams start to split apart in the social cohesion of the body of Christ at this time. When that happens in Acts chapter 6, I'll read what happens in a moment. It's interesting to think about the apostles having to meet this challenge. They don't have an institutional, systemic mechanism in place to deal with it, right? Because they hadn't laid one out. They didn't draw up a business plan or a doctrinal checklist for all the things that they thought should be done. They hadn't had any social sort of demographic challenges like this up to this point. But it's interesting that they didn't even think to lay out a plan for what happens if we encounter something like this, right? We might criticize them for that. But I think it's interesting that they didn't. They're just operating along the leading of the Spirit and with God's wisdom. And here's what happens. So Acts chapter 6, verse 1. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, "It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word." And then the story goes on there, and that's exactly what they do. This gets approval from everyone there. It's interesting. It's sort of a democratic, quasi-democratic, almost congregational process. They want the input of the disciples that they are charged with leading. Right? It's the apostles here. They're the clear authorities in this picture. But the way they go about this is to recommend you guys go find people that conform to these principles, that meet these standards. And they just give them that charge, and they go and find these men who have wisdom and are led by the Spirit. There's a flexibility here that you can kind of see. They don't have a mechanism, a systemic mechanism for dealing with a problem like this, but they do have wisdom. They do have the Spirit, and they have the guidance of the Scriptures. So things are starting to fray apart. Things are starting to potentially threaten the stability of the church and the social cohesion. And the apostles say, here's what we think is prudent. And they're led by the Spirit, and they have wisdom, and they include the people they're charged with leading. They sort of delegate the decision to them, and then they appoint these men. So there is a sort of formal process of oversight here, and these deacons, we call them, are appointed. There's sort of an official appointment given that you might think of in terms of a consecration to a particular ministry. So it's almost like an office here. It's not spelled out as that, but it looks like that. But it's not overly formalized, and there is no written structure for how they're supposed to do this. They're just operating on a flexible interpretation of principles they already had from the Hebrew Scriptures and from what Jesus had taught them. They're using the wisdom that the Lord has given them, and they're operating by the leading of the Spirit. There's a pretty good example here of how to maintain a sort of integrity of principle, but also being flexible enough to deal with a tumultuous and difficult situation. You could look at a lot of other ways where this gets lived out like this. I just thought it's a good example of focusing on the early church and how they would have administered things. And I think that's a pretty good example. So the stability of an institutional function can provide something like that in the best cases, where you see, hey, it's good that we have this structure. But it's also good that we're not married to it. We're not so committed to the structure that we can't figure out a way to deal with a difficult problem that doesn't have a direct or built-in answer. In the worst cases of institutionalism, of administrative cultures gone awry, what you end up with is a version of authoritarian leadership that just says, this is the way we do things, this is what we've built, and you serve the structure. That is when you've jumped the shark. That is when you've got a real problem on your hands. This type of abuse of authority, the unwillingness of the institution to address problems flexibly or enact reforms that might be necessary. When you see institutions adopting that approach, in contrast to what you see in the New Testament, what you see biblically, that's when you get to a almost total breakdown of trust in these institutions. That's frankly what we're dealing with right now, sort of culture-wide. It's true. You can see that, like, the most obvious example of this is things like the Catholic Church. One of the longest, most enduring and biggest institutions on the planet. And through repeated failure to deal with scandals properly, the insistence on trying to protect the institution at the cost of dealing justly with wrongdoing, they've just lost so much credibility, lost so much trust that the institution no longer has. It's just totally broken apart. The trust in that institution is totally broken apart. You could think of news media, print media, TV media. There's just almost no trust left that anyone is getting news according to any sort of journalistic standard of integrity. It's just gone. People just don't trust the media anymore. Rightly so, because they've lost the trust by behaving irresponsibly. That's an institution that used to matter tremendously in keeping people informed and getting journalism to people and getting people the news. Anymore, it's on both left and right, it's just eroded to such a point where that institution no longer functions like a proper institution should. They're just a bunch of sounding heads, right? They're just a bunch of noise that nobody really listens to much anymore. So in the mainstream of our society, think of the media, think of the Catholic Church, and you see the value of institutions, but when they abrogate their role, when they misuse that authority, all bets are off. They no longer have sway. They no longer function in a healthy environment to help do what the society needs them to do. But this is a problem in the church as well. Think of the mainline Protestant denominations. Very few mainline denominations have much credibility left anymore, whether it's the Episcopalians or the Methodists or the Presbyterians. There's just not a lot of credibility left for various reasons, but mainly it's the same sort of thing, the inflexibility to go along with the way the culture is going. In some sense, you could argue that some of the denominations gave up their credibility by being too flexible and too accommodating to the culture. But a lot of the problem is centered on just failing to be able to adapt to the culture around them. We're just going to do things this way. We're going to come and practice things the way it's written in the book, and just doesn't work out. But you also have huge institutional failures that really have caused a problem of public trust in the evangelical world, not just in the mainline Protestant world or the Catholic world. Think of the megachurch culture, the church growth movement, last 20 or 30 years, and the sort of megachurch administrative culture that's grown out of that. You have major collapses, certainly in public trust, but also just these churches themselves are collapsing, from figures like Bill Hybels, Mark Driscoll, James McDonald, Harvest Bible Fellowship. These have all basically fragmented. They are all out. They've all been fired by their own elder boards. They were basically credibly accused, and sometimes some of them admitted to abuse of authority and mismanagement of funds and an assortment of other problems, sexual allegations, things like this. These sort of were functioning like important major institutions because of their size and impact, and they have just depleted all that trust. It just corroded almost overnight. Now, it wasn't overnight. If you're paying attention, you know this was a long simmering process, but the news drops overnight and people are surprised by it. That's partly people's fault for believing in these people and these institutions, but you can see the effect that it has. It causes people to distrust these large megachurch institutional type churches. Calvary Chapel has a similar problem. A lot of abuses inside Calvary Chapels that for a long time went undealt with or got swept under the rug. After Chuck Smith dies, the whole thing just kind of fragments into a bunch of infighting, and without proper institutional leadership, you have either a shell of an institution that's not really doing the work an institution should, or you have just a fragmentation where the stability breaks down and everyone does what they want to do, which is partly what Calvary Chapel's going through or has gone through in the last 5 years or so. In any case, just examples. We could pepper you with examples. But it's the type of thing that we're seeing. It's the type of environment that we've very well entered into. We are in the middle of a firestorm of institutional distrust. We just don't believe our institutions work anymore. there's no real reason to believe they should work. Most of them have done it's their own fault for losing their own credibility, for ruining their own reputations. I'm not saying we should trust them. I'm saying it's appropriate that we don't trust them. But let me follow this up. We should also be prepared for the reality that it's going to create when trust in institutions is no longer evident, when it's no longer there. If you don't have responsible, well-ordered leadership administering churches, especially, that at least function like an institution should, what you will see is a vacuum that will be, and I'm speaking pretty assertively on this here because I'm pretty well convinced that it not only is happening, but it will continue to happen. It will be, that vacuum will be exploited by just as dangerous demagogues, authoritarian leaders of other stripes, opportunists, grifters, and sort of revolutionary fanatics. A vacuum of this sort, where institutions have lost their credibility and no longer function, that vacuum will be filled by other people who will rise to that authoritarian posture. They will become the new institutional leaders that will then determine everyone's new view of what the institutions are doing. We should just be ready for that. I think it's already well underway, but I'm saying it's probably going to get worse. Right now, in the middle of a global pandemic, everyone's looking for leaders. Everyone's looking for institutional answers. Tell us, when can we go back to work? When will the economy get going again? How long do we have to remain in social distancing measures? What should we do to deal with this major problem, this major crisis? We can disdain the institution and the institutional leadership all we want. We can talk about them in appropriately contemptuous terms. But we shouldn't be naive. The new people that fill that vacuum will just become our new institutional leaders, and then we'll have to deal with that again. What I'm suggesting here is that there is a way that the church, developing a proper culture around these ideas, can function like the institutions that we all look to should actually be functioning. And even though we don't have to form a big institutional union, what we can do is show some administrative leadership, show wisdom, and function in responsible ways that institutions should. And that would at least have the impact of providing a witness for people around us that you don't need those institutions for those things. When it comes to spiritual issues, when it comes to answering questions that are theological in nature, when it comes to figuring out how to act wisely in a crisis, the church should be providing the leadership. Apart from these institutional entities we all look to. And then I think people would need those institutions much less than they do. But be that as it may, our impulse is toward order. We don't really like living, as much as we say we love freedom and want to be left alone to do what we want and choose our own, make our own choices, we really gravitate in times of crisis towards someone who will give us security. I think that's what we're going to see, and I think the church should be prepared to have not an administrative culture, but to have a culture of standards, a culture that is ordered, that's reliable, that's stable in difficult times, that is built on the rock, if you will, that then people can come and look to us, not a massive institution that's going to dictate things for them, but to come to us and get wisdom. That, I think, should be the approach. But this should just be part of discipleship. We need to learn as a culture of wisdom how to implement these standards and how to live these things out in real life in a way that people see, oh, here is the way an ordered and properly governed church would work. But it turns out it's not so easy to pull off, right? It takes a lot of work and a lot of thought. And above all, it takes God's grace operating through humble people. And those are hard to find. So let me summarize this with a verse from Hebrews 13, verse 17. Look at the way this is framed here. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be no advantage to you. And pray for us, for we are sure that we have a clear conscience, desiring to act honorably in all things. The author of Hebrews has a similar view. It's interesting because he's talking so much in Hebrews about the institutional leadership of the temple, right? The Levitical priesthood. And what he's pointing out is that Jerusalem will soon be destroyed. Everything that can be shaken will be shaken. Partly he's referencing there the destruction of the temple and the priesthood. And he's commending the new covenant and the new priesthood in Jesus as a sort of new institution that we should look to. And in this regard, he says you should be obeying your leaders. These are people in position of authority who are given the charge of caring for you, watching over your souls. But notice he also says they will also give account. It's not unfettered institutional leadership that's hierarchical. It's leadership that has to do their job because God's placed them there to do it. Given that that's the case, they'll give an account to him. So he says you should make it easier for them. Don't let them do that with joy, without groaning and making it difficult for them. And he also says, pray for us. We have a clear conscience, but he has a mind, the author of Hebrews says, to make sure they are acting honorably in all things. So there's this combination here of this kind of power, this at least influence over people that comes with leadership, has to be connected, has to be tethered to a sense of honor and duty to care for the people, not simply to be in a position over them so that you can tell them what to do. Anyways, there's a lot of places where the Bible balances things like this, but I don't think it gets talked about enough, and I don't think the church does a good enough job of, and I don't think we're seeing a great job of leadership right now on a national level, or a lot of churches, I think, are failing on this point, of standing in the gap and saying, people need leadership, let's give them leadership. But with that comes a deep sense of duty, that unless we are willing to conduct ourselves honorably, we shouldn't expect people will just conform to our standards. So I think it's important to work this all out. Okay, so the second branch of this, discipleship needs to be ordered, but discipleship also needs to be lived in a real personal experience. And with that, we always talk about the gospel in terms of setting us free, right? There is a freedom from traditional religious structures, especially and mostly corrupted ones, which is the case again in the early church, when they are under the sort of failed leadership of a temple authority structure that has become corrupted and drastically failed the people. The people of Jesus would then be free from that institutional bondage, and they would live out a new way of being God's people in a real transformational experience of following Jesus. So this leads to a view of discipleship that emphasizes the freedom to walk in Christ without having to conform to all of these sort of man-made structural impositions. This is a beautiful and powerful and liberating thing, and it is the other branch of what discipleship should look like. We've all seen or had experiences with the sort of dank and dying and moribund institutions that just go through the rituals and perform the things and show up for the services, and you feel like there's no life there. These people aren't transformed by the gospel. They're just doing gospel things, or maybe they're not even doing gospel things. They're just using gospel language. So it's got to be a liberating experience to follow Christ. It's got to be accompanied by a real, genuine, transformational freedom that then gets lived out in people's real lives. And this, by the way, is usually the reaction when institutions become such corrupt and rigid formal structures that people just get fed up with it. This is what they typically do. They just react by saying, you know what? We're just going to liberate ourselves from all of this. Movements in church history that have had a great impact. Let's put it in terms of leadership throughout church history that's impacted people greatly, very often will be identified with this sort of reactionary, or if not reactionary, at least they're reacting against these sort of structures that get overly administrative and institutional. Think of John Bunyan, think of John Wesley, think of Bonhoeffer. These people were on the margins or the very, very edge of their mainstream, the mainstream of their institutions. And that's where they operated. And that's why they were effective. If they tried to stay in the formal structures of these places, they wouldn't have been what they were. They wouldn't have led the sort of renewals that they did. This is very much like Moses. He didn't operate from within Egyptian society to do what he did. He had to be on the outskirts of it. Think of John the Baptist. He's well out of the mainstream. He's doing stuff that mainstream people didn't like, even though he's a Levite. He's baptizing people. He's not doing it as a Levite on the temple grounds in the mikvah baths. He's out in the wilderness. He's a wild prophet in the middle of nowhere that the institutionalists just did not like. And this very much is appropriate for the way Jesus conducted his ministry. He didn't operate within the confines and the patterns of what the temple authorities said he should have. He blew the doors off of that stuff. Most movements that really lead to something like what we would call revival have this quality to them. They're grassroots, they're ground up. They have a very sort of working class, ground up quality to them that they don't rely on the institutions to launch them. They operate on the outskirts of it, on the edges of it anyway. And this is actually a really useful thing. In the best cases of this, you see a real zeal, a real engagement, a real energy to movements like this. And I think that's what's intended when Jesus sets people free. I think that's sort of what he has in mind that will come out of it. For this, for an early church example of this, you might just look at Acts chapter 4, Peter and John challenging and being challenged by the temple authorities there, and the incredible boldness that they come after these guys with, right? First of all, Peter gives them a stem winder of a message. You are the builders who rejected the stone, right? This is the stone that you have rejected. He just goes after them. I imagine he's sort of half screaming it when he preaches it. Then they see this, the temple leadership, and they perceive in Acts 4, verse 13, that these are uneducated and common men. And they're astonished by it. And they recognize that they had been with Jesus. There's this transformative, liberating power that comes just from being on the edge of the institution and not really caring about what these guys think anymore. And so you see this played out here. It's pretty powerful. It allows them to challenge the institution without being a part of it. Now, it's interesting, they haven't rejected it entirely in the sense that they're still going to the temple. They're still worshiping and saying their prayers at the temple. They still consider the temple itself a holy meeting place. And the institution, as it stands, in some sense, they still consider valid. But the way it's being administered, they just reject, and they don't conform to. And they challenge these guys directly. This gets them in a lot of trouble, but that's a story for another day. So that's in the best case of this sort of zealous engagement. You're liberated to experience God's transforming power in this way. That can be a powerful witness to the unbelieving world, and it can be a powerful rebuke to the religious leadership that has already been corrupted. You see that in the early chapters of Acts as well. When this sort of freedom from institutions gets taken, I wouldn't say too far, but when it is not lived out in a wise manner, it does trend into some problems. So the upside, the benefit of this sort of freedom in Christ and in following Christ is there's an adaptability to it. There's a flexibility, as we talked about earlier. You can deal with difficult situations without having to consult the manual. You just have wisdom, you have the Spirit, you are a genuine fellowship of believers who are free in Christ, and you navigate these things together. There's a real flexibility to that. There's a real freedom to that. The upside there is the adaptability. That can turn into a sort of activist mindset that all you're doing is adapting, right? You never settle into a formal way of living. You're just moving from crisis to crisis. You're moving from problem to problem, and you're looking at ways that we can take action. It's the do something disease. There's a problem over here. What should we do? I don't know, let's do something. That can turn into that can give the sense that there is no settled, structured, solid footing on which we stand. We're just running around chasing chasing fires, trying to put them out. And this has led to what I'm calling an activist culture in the church. Activism itself is not really bad. I think what I just described with Peter and John could well be called activism. They become activists for the cause of Christ, for the gospel. They take on a real activist mentality. There's a sort of revolution underway, if you want to say it that way. I don't think that's stretching it quite too far. Activism is itself, or this sort of revolutionary attitude, isn't really necessarily a bad thing. I'm not sure we're prohibited from being activists, right, by the scriptures. It's more a prudential question concerning what is worth pursuing on these with this activist zeal, and maybe more importantly, how we go about it. It's choosing what you're going to be an activist about, and then once you've set your course, I'm gonna take action over here. How do you go about doing that? Again, it's a prudential matter. This is a wisdom question. Do you just run at the problem and start yelling biblical truth at it? Do you just start quoting verses? That's not the wisdom approach. Could it work? Maybe. But that's what I would call an activist culture, an activist mindset. It's not a wisdom mindset, which allows for activism. To follow the distinction there. Look at 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 14. This is a fascinating little section. Peter has a lot to say about Christians engaging with the culture and government in a time where they are treated as a minority culture. There's a lot I think we can learn from 1 Peter in terms of how the culture around us is sort of closing in on us as evangelicals. And so I think his insight here is really profound and valuable. Verse 14, 1 Peter 4, if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. The context pretty clearly here is Christians are coming under attack from the culture around them for the stand they've taken for Christ. And he says, look, if they're insulting you for that, you're blessed. It's hard, which is encouraging to hear, but most of us still don't want to be insulted for our faith. And it does happen. But he adds this caveat that's really important. But you better not be suffering these insults because you're an evildoer. And most of us read the list and we're like, well, all right, a murderer or a thief or an evildoer. We're not those things, so therefore we are righteous when the media or when the enemies of the gospel or when whomever insults us and derides our faith. But the last word he adds on here is really interesting. NASB has a troublesome meddler. The ESV just has a meddler. The King James translates this as a busybody, which I like. I think busybody captures it pretty well. If you're suffering insults because you're a busybody, that doesn't bring you glory. That doesn't bring Christ glory. You shouldn't be honored because of that. It's an interesting compound word in Greek. It literally means something like overseeing the affairs of strangers, getting into strangers' stuff and being an overseer. It's the same word as elder in episcopa, to keep an eye on. If Christians are too involved in keeping an eye on the culture, on the world around them and how they're behaving and all their stuff, we run the risk of becoming busybodies. The NIV has troublemakers. I think this actually accurately describes a lot of the church today, right? And I think this is going to cut close to the bone for a lot of us. Our impulse is to see unrighteousness, bad behavior in politics and in the culture and in Hollywood, etc., and to go after it like it's our business to cause all of those people to conform to our biblical standard. And I think while that impulse is good and one that I share, and frankly, it's something that I do quite a bit, I think we should have a sort of autocorrect function before we run off and start to oversee all of the business of the unbelieving world and act like we must advocate all of the causes that we see as just and righteous in our culture today. I think we're dangerously close at this point to running afoul of this verse and becoming precisely the type of busybodies that Peter says we shouldn't be. So this is a deep challenge. Personally, like this is a challenge for me to actually think through. I think we really have to struggle with our approach as witnesses to the world around us, the unbelieving world around us, that gets us dangerously close to adopting an activist mentality, which turns us into little more than rabble rousers, right? Sort of, we're going to form our own revolution. This is an understandable impulse, just like we have an understandable impulse toward order and security. We want to build the rules out so that people will follow them. We also have an impulse toward rebellion, toward reacting against things we don't like. So instead of seeking to persuade people through a good testimony, through a wise engagement with the culture, instead of, as Paul says, let your speech be with grace and seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer people in the unbelieving world. Instead of this standard of wisdom leading to persuasion, preaching and proclaiming the gospel so that we can win people, I think that a lot of the church, or large segments of it anyway, are dangerously close to just discrediting the gospel. And then the scorn that the culture heaps on us, sometimes you got to wonder if it's basically deserved. Have we earned that contempt by acting like busybodies for so long and advocating causes that really don't have much to do with the gospel, but we so vociferously and so almost violently hold on to them and advocate those causes that the only way the outside world, the unbelieving world, can see a lot of evangelicals is in terms of just raving moralists who want to control everyone's behavior. Like, that's a caricature. It's not fair. It's not really true. I pray God it's not true of our church or most of us. But when like major, well-known, forward-facing spokesmen of evangelical Christianity in a time as tumultuous as ours are people like Jim Baker, like Paula White, like Jerry Falwell Jr. Like, I could run down a long list of names for you, and that's just on the right. On the left, we have the Jen Hatmakers and the Rachel Hollises and the progressive Christianity that gives a picture of evangelicalism that is just sort of, well, not biblical. Let's leave it at that. I won't go through all the examples. But when these are major evangelical leaders who are put forward as spokesmen, and that's what we have to offer, it's no real wonder to me why we have failed to earn the reputation of a culture of wisdom and integrity, right? I look at those, if you just Google any of those names, do 10 minutes of reading or watching YouTube videos about things that they teach and things that they say on a pretty regular basis. It's no small wonder to me that this is how evangelicals are viewed. Some of that we have earned by letting these people be our face, by letting them speak for us. If we don't adopt our own culture of wisdom and integrity, and if we don't call out these sort of caricatured bad versions of Christian leadership, then I think we don't have much chance of winning people to a message of the gospel that says, yes, we want to challenge the norms and structures that we see around us. But no, we're not going to turn into raving lunatics as we do that. This is kind of what we can expect. The early church gives us the example. They also give us a whole lot of principles to operate from. It's true they don't give us a handbook, but we do have the Spirit. We have the Word. Soon we'll be able to get back together and worship together and fellowship with each other in person, and that will give us the ability to help build each other up, to hold each other accountable, and we can maintain and cultivate a culture of wisdom, a culture of witness, a culture of integrity and holiness, that we can subvert these sort of extreme and misguided examples of church culture and help each other grow in grace and grow in sanctification. It's a tough line to walk. There's a lot more to talk about. I'm going to wrap this up because I know I'm sort of filibustering here. It's a tough line to walk. These things are not I mean, I'd argue a lot of them are spelled out clearly enough in principle, but they're not given to us in a manual. So we have to do it through wisdom. But we can walk it. We can walk it by God's grace. And frankly, we have to walk it. There's no better option here. We can't just join the one side or the other and say, well, this looks better to me. I think I'll be that type of church. I'm saying that's not biblically an option. We have to find a way to not be those guys, not be those guys, not listen to this advice, not take that bad teaching. The alternatives are not alternatives. The biblical line is a thin one. That's the one we need to walk. So let's cultivate a culture of wisdom. Let's cultivate a culture of grace. Let's be a culture that has the witness of Jesus as at the front of mind, and a culture of holiness. Next time, we're going to start off on a more ritual reading cycle, a more what we call an electionary approach. We're sort of using the synagogue reading, Torah reading lectionary, combined with the verses from the prophets, and then we've got a bunch of New Testament, mostly gospel verses that we're going to fold into that. So each week, here's what I hope to do, and we'll talk about this more going forward, and I'll send everyone out information on this. But what we hope to do is each week send out the reading for the upcoming Sunday. So the reading will incorporate verses from the Torah, verses from usually the prophets, but that can be also the historical books of the Old Testament, and then some gospel readings most of the time. We'll space that out throughout the week for everyone to have something to read and think about and meditate on. I'll try to send out some commentary and some things to think about, some background and just explanations of some variations on the text and things like that, just to help everyone along in their reading, maybe some devotional stuff. But then what we want to do is the Sunday messages will be based in some way or another around the text that we are all reading through together. So they'll tend to be hopefully shorter messages. They'll be more exhortative. So we'll do some explanation, but we'll really try to lean into how we can take the reading that we're all doing each week together around the same set of texts, and how we can take that and find encouragement from it. And maybe there are some challenges built into the reading that we have to encounter. So we've got Passover and Easter coming up next week. That'd be a perfect time to start this cycle. We'll start with some Passover readings. We'll start to prepare for that. Next week, we'll have a teaching that pertains to Passover in some way. If you can during the week, pick up some matzah if you don't have any in your house, and some wine or grape juice. And maybe next week we'll be able to sit down. We won't do a big elaborate thing, but we can maybe sit down and share a communion meal virtually online together. So with your own families in your own homes, take communion with your spouse, take communion with your kids there, include them in any way you want. And maybe I'll just at least lead us into the opportunity to do that. It's a little weird to be doing it not in person, but we'll maybe get the sense of the flavor of that. And it's perfect timing since we got Passover and Easter coming up, and we really don't want to leave off the Lord's Supper for however long we're going to be apart. So maybe we can just do it in homes, from house to house, and we'll try to accommodate that next week. So we'll see you then. Look for those readings in your email inbox during the week, sometime during this week. And next week we'll come back with a message on Passover, and we'll see you then.